Kyiv woke to something strange this morning, and for once it wasn't the war. The city centre was closed amid a barrage of not missiles but anticipation. And only one motorcade was allowed on the road, to the bemusement of some and the delight of others. In a city listening out for every rumour and every air raid siren, news had crept out under the blanket of secrecy of a special visitor. Without the military help provided by America in the last year of war, the president walking here today might have been called Putin, not Biden. He is hailed here as a saviour. For him to show up in person in the glare of sirens is a big deal. But President Biden also treads a fine line between supplying American weapons but not troops, between a war partly fought on its behalf but not declared in its name. At the presidential palace, the two walk side by side. By age, they could easily be father and son. And both need each other. Zelensky-Biden for sheer survival. Biden-Zelensky to tap into his spirit, to renew the vows between the West and its values. The president started with a memory almost exactly a year old.
It was very late at night in Washington, very early in the morning here in Kyiv. Russian planes were in the air and tanks were rolling across your border. You told me that you could hear the explosions in the background. I'll never forget that. And the world was about to change. You know, 1 year later, Kyiv stands, and Ukraine stands. Democracy stands. The Americans stand with you, and the world stands with you.
President Zelensky responded by saying that this year, 2023, must be the year of victory.
And that's how long we're going to be with you, Mr. President, for as long as it takes.
We'll do it.
Thank you.
But with what? For Ukraine to drive Russia from all its territory, it needs the kind of long-range weapons that President Biden did not promise today. But what he did give his host was a moment to milk in a war fought on social media as well as on the battlefield. Within an hour of Biden leaving, the Ukrainian government had put together the music video version of history. Divine intervention won't win this war for Ukraine. It'll be the ability to produce more missiles and artillery shells than Russia in a brutal conflict of attrition in which Russia already behaves as if it's at war with NATO. Joe Biden now has his star on Kyiv's alley of bravery for visiting foreign leaders.
Thank you. What a great honor.
Thank you very much.
What a great honor.
But who can really tell at this stage where this alley will lead? What this bond of friendship will keep demanding, and when, if at all, the West will say no more.
So this is the first question.
So what do they make of today's visit in places nearer to the front line in this war? Well, our international editor, Lindsay Hilsum, is in the southern city of Odessa now. Lindsay, what do they make of this visit, of Biden's visit, where you are?
Matt, the people I spoke to today were hugely enthusiastic. They said it had great symbolic import. One woman said, "It makes me feel that we can be victorious." But then she also went on to say, what we really need is weapons, weapons, more weapons. Now, President Biden did say that the US would be providing another $500 million worth of weapons. That is a lot of weapons. But still, you have to think about the facts on the ground. At the moment, just take 105mm howitzer shells. The Ukrainians are using as many of those in a month as the US manufactures in a year, in a whole year. And it's not easy to turn that around and make more and more and more. And then there's the issue of what the military analysts call mass, the number of soldiers that you can put onto the battlefield. Now, the Russians have made gains recently because they've just thrown in a lot more soldiers. The population of Ukraine is 43 million. The population of Russia is 143 million. So that just goes to show how many more soldiers Russia can put on the battlefield and how difficult it is for Ukraine as they wait for more modern weapons from America and Europe.
Now, tomorrow, Lindsay, all eyes will be on Moscow, where President Putin will give a very important speech. What can we expect?
Well, people I spoke to in Odessa today were very scared about that. They said they were really worried about what Putin was going to say and what Putin was going to do. It's been pretty quiet here in Odessa in recent weeks, but they're worried that there's going to be more cruise missile attacks on infrastructure. One woman I spoke to was going back to Kyiv in the north, where her family was. She said that it had been hell there, and she was worried that the next few days were going to be even worse. And then the other issue is that the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, is expected in Moscow, as you said, either later tonight or tomorrow. Now, President Biden said today, the world stands with you, to Zelensky. That's not completely true. Much of the South is not with President Zelensky. A lot of countries, particularly in Africa, are rather tending towards the Russian side, and in Asia too. And of course, the most important one is China. China has not provided weapons to Russia, except for some drones which are commercially available. But the Americans are very worried, and Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, said this weekend they're very concerned that China may be on the brink of providing weaponry to Russia. That would completely change things. China is one of the biggest manufacturers of weapons, including high-precision weapons in the world. That would change everything, militarily and geopolitically as well.
Lindsay, thanks very much indeed. Well, on that note, almost a year after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, what have been the wider ramifications of this war around the world? Even as President Biden was choosing to visit Kyiv, the Chinese foreign minister, as we just heard, was reportedly on his way to Moscow. So is the globe once again forming into two opposing blocs? Here's Jonathan Rugman.
For Joe Biden, Europe is a war-prone continent. America would rather escape, but never quite can. Because the Cold War never really ended, forcing the West to hold Ukraine close in a way a year ago nobody was quite sure it would. 60 years ago, it was President Kennedy rallying an embattled West Berlin, a historic morale boost after a wall had been erected by the Soviet East.
Ich bin ein Berliner.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
When that wall did come down, years of war in the former Yugoslavia followed, and America belatedly intervened. Now to Ukraine, where Russia's imperialist ambition was rekindled, where it turns out that the end of history never happened. The Russians take no lectures from American presidents about invasion. This was George Bush secretly visiting his troops in Iraq 20 years ago. Barack Obama did the same in Afghanistan in 2010. Of course, the Russians had been there, done that. And when the American-led mission ended 2 years ago, it was in humiliation and nation-building failure. Now Ukraine has breathed new life into a battered NATO alliance. And this is a war that Joe Biden can sell back home as long as American lives are not being lost. At the weekend, his Secretary of State warned his Chinese counterpart not to supply the Russians weapons, in what is becoming a battleground for global influence. China's top diplomat, Wang Yi, was in Hungary today, welcomed in a country which is a NATO and EU outlier dependent on Russian energy. America's fear is that China will invade Taiwan if Western resolve crumbles and Vladimir Putin wins in Ukraine. At the weekend, the North Koreans test-launched a ballistic missile with a range of over 500 miles. Another reason why the Americans would rather pivot from Europe to the Pacific.
The General Assembly is now voting.
North Korea is one of 40 countries, including India and South Africa, which refused to condemn Vladimir Putin at the UN. And many of them resent Washington strong-arming them into taking sides. And after a year of trench warfare, it's perhaps no coincidence that this is the BAFTA-winning film of the moment. Ukraine is not northern France, but on the Eastern Front, it is another war of attrition. A war with no victory in sight and no sign of the mutual exhaustion required for both sides to stop.
Jonathan Rugman reporting. Well, joining me now here on the balcony is the Ukrainian MP Alexander Mereshko, who heads up the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Parliament here. Thank you very much for coming back on the programme after all these months. How did you feel when you saw President Biden in your city today?
Well, to me it was a true miracle, because deep down I hoped that something like that might happen. When we found out that President Biden is coming to Poland, we realized that it's impossible, politically, for safety reasons, but it happened.
You didn't know he was going to come?
I didn't know.
When did you find out about it?
Unexpectedly, I was heading to my place of work, to the Parliament, and then I realized that I cannot move because
everything was shut, wasn't it? They blocked every road in the centre, and the Parliament's just down there.
Yeah, the central part was blocked by police, and then I realized that something is going on, and I couldn't believe my eyes that I saw from a distance President Biden, and to us it's a huge boost to our morale.
You've had Macron, I think, a couple of times, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, Boris Johnson practically lives here. So why is Biden so much more important? It's the obvious, isn't it? Yeah. It's America.
First of all, he is a true leader of the free world, and our president is also leader of free world. So we had in the same place the biggest leaders of free democratic world, which is very symbolic. It's a hugely symbolic event to us.
And yet he did not promise you the weapons that your foreign minister and your president specifically asked for at the Munich Security Conference: long-range missiles and fighter jets.
We don't lose hope. I think that this time this road from no to yes will be much shorter, because I believe that we'll get everything what we need, and very soon.
Because that is a road very well travelled, isn't it? Whenever you ask for something, the international community says, yeah, maybe, maybe not, and then a couple of months later you've got it. But you need the stuff right now, don't you?
Yes, we say that we need it for yesterday, because such heavy weaponry helps to save lives of our soldiers and civilian population. But we see that the attitude of our allies is very dynamic, and they give more and more support to Ukraine.
We know that not the entire world is on your side. India abstained at the Security Council, rather the General Assembly of the United Nations. South Africa is against you, and crucially, China. The Chinese foreign minister is on his way to Moscow right now. And, of course, there were talks at the weekend from the American Secretary of State that China might even be providing lethal aid to Russia. So how worried are you about that?
We are worried, we're concerned, but I believe that China fears sanctions by the United States. And the thing is that China is a close ally to Russia. We understand this. But our support and our help are sanctions by the US, and China is afraid of these sanctions.
But China could swing the war more in Russia's favor, couldn't it? And at the moment, things are not going terribly well for you on the battlefield.
Well, China is moving in this direction because China is supporting Russia economically by buying in huge quantities Russian oil and gas and financing Russian war machine. China supports spreading Russian propaganda and Russian narratives, which is dangerous. And China is voting against Ukraine at the General Assembly, which is also dangerous. We are aware of this, but we don't count on China.
Both sides are exhausting each other's reservoirs of men and also material. I mean, it is a very, very costly war in both treasure and lives. When do you think the time might come where you sit down with the other side and talk about peace?
Well, I believe that first we need to win this war, and we do hope that this year will become victorious to us.
But what does winning actually look like?
Winning to us is very simple in terms of international law, is liberation of our whole territory, including Crimea, of course.
Including Crimea?
Absolutely.
Even though you've been privately told by some officials in the West that that is very unlikely.
I'm sure that we will return Crimea, just a matter of time, because to us, if we don't do, it will create very dangerous precedent when the aggressor is not punished by rewarded by territorial concessions. It shouldn't happen, because otherwise it opens Pandora box, so to speak.
Alexander Mereshko, thank you very much indeed.